Good Thursday morning to you. This is Greg again. It's 8:37 in the morning, and we are finishing the second chapter of the Gospel of Mark. We're going to read today from verses 23 through 28. Let's begin. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked on. They began to pick they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to them, "Look, why are they doing what is lawful on the Sabbath?" Well, first thing we find out is the Pharisees are evidently following them around. They've started coming to decide that Jesus is not who they wanted him to be or who they thought he should be. He's already done some heretical things in their minds. We saw not long ago that he said that a man's sins were forgiven, and that was not to be done by anybody but God, and they didn't see him as God. Okay. It says that one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. What we're going to find out is that the Sabbath is what the problem is in this scripture. So let's go to the actual law. We go to the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20 verses 8 through 11. And let's look at this law of the Sabbath. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy." Okay, dedicating to God. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy. All right, the Sabbath day we learned from this that Sabbath day was a day of rest. It was a day to be made holy or dedicated to God. God did all of his work in 6 days when he created everything. And on the seventh day, he rested. Now, he didn't need to rest. God wasn't tired, but he knew that we did. He created us, and he knew that after a while we would wear down. So we needed rest. And also we needed to have a special time to dedicate to him, because otherwise we might not do that. So he made the Sabbath holy, and he said, don't do any work then. Okay. Now the Pharisees, they had 39 categories of things that you could not do on the Sabbath. Not 39 things you couldn't do, but I'm talking about general categories. There were tons of things you couldn't do. They took the law and they broke it down into minute things you can do. Now, I was reading a commentary called Enduring Word online. It's enduringword.com. I like to go to it sometimes and glean some things from what the author says. And I wanted to read to you. This is just an example. A man could not carry something in his right hand or in his left hand, across his chest or on his shoulder. But you could carry something with the back of your hand, with your foot, with your elbow, or in your ear, your hair, or the hem of your skirt, or your shoe or your sandal. Or on the Sabbath, you are forbidden to tie a knot, except a woman could tie a knot in her girdle. So if a bucket of water had to be raised from a well, you couldn't tie a rope to the bucket, but a woman could tie her girdle to the bucket. And this is just you see the minute details and where in the world do you get this? You can do work with your foot, but you can't do it with your left or right hand unless it's the back of your hand. These are crazy. Michelle and I, we went to the Holy Land, and we learned while we were there that on the Sabbath, people could only walk so many steps because after so many steps, evidently it was considered work. So some of the more Orthodox Jews would come to the hotels during the weekend, and they would stay so they could go to the Temple Mount, or go to the synagogue there, and they could not press the button on the elevator, because if they did, that was considered work, pushing a button. So the elevators were literally made to go up and down and stop at each floor on the Sabbath. That way they could get on without having to commit work. This is ridiculous. But these things This is how the Pharisees, they were very legalistic and had all these ways that you could not, or all these things you could not do, or else you were breaking this law of the Sabbath. So harvesting was literally a way of working. So harvesting would be a way of breaking the Sabbath. Harvesting for profit, doing this work so that you can earn a living, that would be working. But now the disciples, they were going through this grain field. They weren't robbing it because the Old Testament allowed for people to take some and eat. But the Pharisees saw them because they picked off some pieces of grain, rubbed them in their hand to make the grain, and would eat it because they were hungry. Not because they were making a profit, but because they were hungry. So the disciples, they weren't harvesting. They were simply satisfying their hunger. They were simply eating. That is not forbidden on the Sabbath. And so let's continue on. And Jesus is going to explain to the Pharisees what's going on. He said, or in 25, he answered, Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, and he also gave some to his companions. Now, this story comes from 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6, if you want to look it up. 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. The bread that he's talking about, the consecrated bread, this was made for worship. And after it was used for worship, the priest would eat it, and only the priest, nobody else could eat it. So, for David and his men to eat it, that was technically unlawful. But the priest allowed David and his men to eat it because he saw, and it was probably already used, and new bread probably was being used for worship. But it was time to eat the bread, and he saw that it was better to give this bread to David and his people because they were hungry, because their need for food outweighed ceremonial regulations or this ritual. Okay. In other words, the person was more important than the rule. Now, Pharisees, they would have known this story. They would have known the story. Jesus says, Have you never read? Have you never read what David and his companions did? They would have known the story. They know the Old Testament. They know the law. But evidently, they would have glossed over the true meaning of this story. They would have known that David ate on the Sabbath, but they kind of disregarded that part. Maybe it wasn't what they wanted to hear. Maybe they just didn't understand why he could. Maybe they said, well, this really doesn't matter because it is the Sabbath. We've got to understand in light of our ways instead of what we read here. All right, let's finish. I love these two comments. Then Jesus said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I love that. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then verse 28 says, So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, this law of keeping the Sabbath was meant to give people rest. Remember when we read it, we learned it was to be kept holy, dedicated to God. It was to be meant to give people rest. It wasn't meant to make things harder on people. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made to help people, not make it harder for people. And then Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, even the Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, he's saying he is more important, or that he is above the law. The law, ironically, the Pharisees don't understand this right now, but we know it. He's above the law because he wrote the law. He gave the law. He's God. So anyway, he's the Lord even of the Sabbath, of all the law, all the Old Testament. So Dave, what can we learn? Jesus told the Pharisees some things they didn't like, and he'll tell them this throughout his ministry. We saw earlier on that he told the Pharisees, or he told the man, his sins were forgiven. The Pharisees didn't like that. He tells them now that he's above the law. They're definitely not going to like that. So what can we learn from this? We can learn that as we read the Bible, we can do the same thing. We can see things, we can hear things when we read that we don't like. We can read and kind of disregard some things. We can read, where it says forgive others as many times as it takes, and say, well, I'll forgive somebody one time, or I really can't forgive that person. So we read the law the way we want to read it instead of the way Jesus tells us. We can read, love our enemies in that way. We can read all kinds of different things and say, well, that's not how I believe, or that's not how I want to believe. And so we can just gloss over those things and read the things we like or the things we want to believe. Let's remember, Jesus is not only Lord of the Sabbath, but Jesus is Lord of our lives. So what Jesus says goes. Well, I also will say that when Jesus tells us to do things, it's for the better. So remember today to make Jesus Lord of your life. Live your life to honor him and to live by what he said. Have a blessed day and be safe.